Last week, we here in the United States marked the 150th anniversary of the end of our Civil War. It was on April 9th, 1865, that General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant and essentially ended the Civil War after 4 years. There are some subsequent events that took place that could also be considered as marking the end of the war, but most people treat Lee's surrender to Grant as the end of the war. For all practical purposes, it was. And at the time, that news was greeted throughout the North, at least, and through the Union-controlled areas of the South of the Confederacy, with the ringing of church bells. And on Thursday, for the 150th anniversary, that celebration was reenacted all across the United States at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, because Eastern is the time to be, Eastern Time for life. The bells were rung at Appomattox Courthouse, which was the site of the surrender of Lee. And then 15 minutes later, bells were rung in towns all over the place, including right here where I live in Sharpsburg. Sharpsburg, of course, is a very important location in the Civil War. It was the site of what the Confederates called the Battle of Sharpsburg, and what the Union and most other people today refer to as the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day of the entire war. And Ashley and I sat out on the stoop in front of our building and listened to the bells. The bells rang for 4 minutes, 1 minute for each year of the war. And then afterwards, we came inside, and I thought it would be a cool idea to watch the last episode of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary to sort of mark the occasion. And we did, and it had been a few years since I had seen it. I have the Civil War series on DVD, and I've watched it straight through. I don't even know how many times. It's one of my favorite things. It's so beautiful and so well done. It's artful. It's not just a documentary that sort of gives you facts about things that happened, but it really tells you a story in a really powerful way, and really brings forward the tragedy of the war and the reality of the war. Sitting here today, 150 years after the end of the conflict, it's easy to look at films like that, or to look at photographs, the old Matthew Brady photographs of casualties on the battlefield, or pictures of armies marching in formation, men standing in rows with their muskets on their shoulders and their uniforms on. And it's easy to forget when you look at those images that those are real people. Those people actually lived. They're not just figures in a photograph. They're not just objects in a museum. They were real people. They had lives. They had friends. They had families. They had loves. They felt pain and grief. They lived. It all was real. It actually happened. And it's unthinkable to think of something like that happening today. One of the introductory lines of the Ken Burns series is that Americans waged war on each other for 4 years, if only to create the kind of country where no one could ever imagine that sort of thing happening. And that's kind of what happened. If you look at other parts of American history since the Civil War, there have certainly been times of great internal strife. There have been moments where it seemed like things would come to blows between different factions of Americans. There were incredibly heated conflicts, American versus American, over economics, over labor issues, over women's rights, over civil rights for people of color, over other wars. In the 60s, there were times, I am told, and I am given the impression, because I wasn't alive back then, that the strife and the bitterness toward the Vietnam War threatened to end in some kind of conflict between the two sides at one point. During the tensest, most violent part of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and the early 60s, there were times where it did come to armed conflict, and on a very small scale. There were never armies clashing over it, but there were acts of violence. There were instances where the police or the National Guard had to be called out to sort of put down insurrections, if you were, if you will, or to maintain the peace. But we've never had a moment since the Civil War where it really seemed like it was going to come to a military conflict, where two American armies were going to clash and shoot at each other and kill each other in order to settle a dispute. That sort of thing since the Civil War seems just unthinkable. And yet it really happened. They were dealing with the same sorts of issues that we deal with today, albeit in a far more heightened way. We still struggle with the issues that the Civil War was fought over and that were in the air during the war. One of the things that Ken Burns' documentary does is it fills you in on what everybody did after the war. Once the war is over, all the major figures that the film has been following throughout the 4 years of the war, we sort of get their epilogues. And, you know, Frederick Douglass did not retire after the Civil War. Frederick Douglass, the tireless crusader against slavery, one of the most eloquent and powerful abolitionist voices the world has ever seen. He did not shave his beard and just return home to quiet retirement after the Civil War was over and after slavery had been abolished and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments had been passed. He continued to work for civil rights, for African Americans, for freed slaves who had been given their freedom but now found themselves living in poverty, forced to take jobs often on the same plantations where they had been enslaved and work as sharecroppers or as hired hands. Frederick Douglass and the men and women who were on his side continued to agitate and to work and to campaign for civil rights. And they had a lot of work to do. There was a very long struggle ahead. And it's a struggle that we still find ourselves facing today. The Civil War itself, the military conflict, is long over, but the underlying issues that sort of drove that war are still very much with us. And I am sure that when he was continuing to work for the rights of his people in the late 1860s after the war had been concluded, that Frederick Douglass had to put up with hearing the same sorts of arguments that activists for civil rights and social justice have to hear today. I'm sure that there were people who said to Frederick Douglass, look, slavery is over, man. What more do you want? You wanted us to end slavery. We ended it. What are we still having this conversation for? Or, look, we passed the amendments. You have your citizenship. You have your right to vote. What more do you want? And 100 years later, there were people hearing the same thing. Look, we got rid of Jim Crow. We got rid of voter suppression laws. We got rid of separate but equal. What more do you want? You've got your legal equality. What more do you want? And we still hear that today. We still hear that to this very day. There are still people who respond to efforts by oppressed groups, marginalized groups, not just racial groups, but also people who have been discriminated against or faced hardship and mistreatment because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation or their national origin or their religion or lack of religion, that have heard similar arguments. Look, you've got your legal rights. What more do you want? What more do you women want? What more do you black folks want? What more do you Muslims want? What more do you gay people want? You've got your legal rights. That's what you wanted, right? We gave it to you. And it seems to me that the forces that we fight in that war, in that cultural war, that social war, have been forced to retreat many, many times. The people who have stood in opposition or resistance to civil rights for marginalized groups, social justice, they have been forced to retreat many, many times, but they've never surrendered. There are still those who would try to deny really basic human rights to people, and who would also deny the existence of forces that oppress those people. They have never surrendered. They have never given up. They've moved back They've changed tactics. One of the most insidious tactics they employ, whether they know it or not, is to try to convince people that, in fact, the war is over, that there is no more need for activism and agitation and speaking out on these subjects, that people now who speak out for civil rights or for human rights, for marginalized groups, are just troublemakers. They're pushing against an open door at this point. There are no more battles to fight, and we see how dangerous that attitude can be. That was the justification used by the majority of the U.S. Supreme Court when the pre-clearance clause of the Voting Rights Act was struck down. The majority opinion essentially said, well, we don't really need this anymore. Racism isn't a problem. I mean, it was a problem when we wrote the law, but it's not such a problem anymore. So we can just do away with this. And as soon as it was done away with, some of the very sorts of laws that it was written to prevent were suddenly being pushed into consideration in state legislatures that had been freed from those requirements imposed on them by pre-clearance in the Voting Rights Act. So we see that it is actually still very much a problem. It is no longer as much of a problem in terms of how the law is written, but it is very much a problem in terms of how the law is enforced and in terms of how we see each other and how we treat each other. We see that the cultural battle, the social battle, the economic battle is still being fought to this day. And there are still forces standing against us that want to stop the push for equality. They want to stop the push for progress. In some cases by trying to convince us that the fight is over, that we should just lay down our arms, so to speak, and be happy with the world that we have and treat these problems as though they don't exist, as though they've been solved. And that's dangerous. And that's the legacy that we still live with of the Civil War. It's the favor that the Civil War did us, and it's also the worst disservice that the Civil War, and thinking of the Civil War in that way, can do to social justice movements in the United States today. It shows us how important those fights are, especially how important it is to win those fights. And it also gives us the danger, the threat of lulling ourselves into a false sense of security and a false sense of accomplishment by allowing us to think of the Civil War itself as the last chapter in that book, as a kind of closure, which in many ways it was, but in many very important ways it was not. Because even though we have driven those forces that stand against equality and fight against equality and progress and for prejudice and for white supremacy, which continues to hang on to every last bit of influence it possibly can get its nails into, even though we have driven all of those forces from battlefield after battlefield after battlefield, they have never surrendered to this day. They continue to fight, and we must continue to fight them, because it is not a war in the military sense anymore. It's a war in the cultural sense, in the social sense. But it's not a war that we can afford to lose. It's a war that we have to keep fighting, and it's a war that we absolutely have to win. So, to the good fight. I ask myself, what's the best way to end an extended monologue on the subject of the Civil War and social justice? And I thought, yeah, cornball theatrics. That's the best way to go.